Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this session of Ask the Expert. As I see a lot of new names, I just wanted to quickly review some background information on AFI Mac and who we are. So AFI Mac is obviously a part of Dalton Group of companies. We've been operational for about 30 years now, formerly known as AccuFax. Through a series of acquisitions and partnerships, we later became AFI Mac. We are a privately owned company with a global footprint. We work alongside several sister companies, which you may have come into encounters with throughout the years, ASAP Secured, ISB Canada, Focus Point, just to name a few. Our Canadian headquarters is located in Milton, Ontario, and it's probably worth noting that we have offices across Canada in almost every province. Historically, we are well known in the labor dispute space, providing support to those who are navigating through potential or active labor disruptions. However, throughout the years, we have evolved to meet the diverse needs of our clients, which takes us to our next slide. So to better understand our knowledge base, I just kind of wanted to share some of the areas that we specialize in. Obviously, I won't read them all out to you, but again, we're really well versed in these areas, which takes me to my next slide. So speaker buyers, I am speaking alongside my colleague Jim Rovers, which I will hand over the mic to.
Hi folks, so again, appreciate you joining today. My name is Jim Rovers. I've been actively involved in the security industry since 1989, assisting both insurance and corporate clients throughout Canada and the United States. And, I'd like to thank you for joining today and look forward to getting into the meat of our presentation here shortly and imparting some knowledge with respect to the topic today.
Thank you, Jim. So while my position represents all banners within Dalton umbrella, same as my counterpart, Jim Rovers, my primary concentration is within investigations and protection services. It's also worth noting that I have dedicated significant time in developing a solid understanding of activism, as it has slightly increased throughout the years, and it will show through these examples that we provide during this presentation. So, today's objectives. Today we would like to discuss the growing threat of workplace violence. Our ultimate goal with this presentation is to provide you with the guidance to understanding threats and have a plan in place, as it is everyone's responsibility, not just security. Seeing that many of our attendees on this webinar come from an HR background, I wanted to quickly use a quote that I came across today that fits right into this webinar. It was in regards to the changing role of HR. So it says, they also have the responsibility to help cultivate the right cultures and practices to ensure the business's most critical resource, its employees, are set up to thrive. Again, great article. I'd be happy to share after the presentation. Just send me an email and I can send this great article to everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophie. And here's what I'd like to do is sort of set the table here a little bit. There was a recent video put out and not too long ago, about a month ago, and I think it really depicts what's going on, just sort of in Canada, but I think the world as a whole. There was a gentleman in British Columbia. He went to buy a coffee. With that coffee, they clearly got his order wrong. He proceeded to pour his coffee into the cash register and then push the cash register off the counter and threaten the frontline worker. So I think we are finding more and more that people's tolerance and resilience has diminished substantially over time, and we're seeing more and more people acting out and in various forms in a way go that way. So let's talk about the threats a little bit. Social media and online threats. I do firmly believe at this point in time that social media, as well as the web itself, has been weaponized somewhat. And I think we used to look at threats in terms of harm that were going to happen to our people, whether they were frontline staff or they were in our buildings and in our facilities. And we're seeing more and more that if a person has an interaction that they don't feel that they've enjoyed, they will certainly take to social media and online and post their thoughts. And some of those can become fairly abusive in nature. I'll use an example. This was related to an HR department. They had a gentleman in that had an issue with a long-term disability claim. He had met with the HR folks. At the end of the day, following that, he went home and he posted a picture on his Facebook platform that showed him with what appeared to be an automatic weapon. Now, the good news is that was an airsoft gun that's used for like paintballing or airsoft type situations. However, the caption read, "If those BIT, and I won't continue, don't get my claim sorted out, they'll be hell to pay." And certainly that was one where, hey, this guy's acted a little bit differently from time to time, can be a little bit over the top. That organization viewed that as a threat. And I think a lot of times people go, well, it's only on social media. There's not a lot of meaning to that. So keep that in mind. Certainly we're seeing an increase in both verbal and physical abuse and harassment towards employees. And I used the Tim Hortons example earlier. We are also finding where your brand is becoming under siege. If you don't like something about an organization, go after the brand. And certainly Sophie mentioned activists earlier. We're seeing a lot of movement in the food, fur, meat processing. Also a lot of activism around anything to do with packaging, plastic packaging, things of that nature. So they're targeting the likes of, and I can mention it because we're certainly seeing it in the news, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Unilever, and some of these other groups. So going after your brand has become popular. We had a situation last week where a group of activists attended a grocery store and they proceeded to head to the meat counter, pour fake blood on the floor, and then tried to engage the store level manager in a confrontation, which they hope to videotape, obviously put on social media and make your brand look bad. We've also seen the targeting of senior executives where they're posting home addresses, things of that nature for your senior executives and senior C-suite executives, where they're being targeted in their residence. And certainly anytime they're out speaking at functions, whether that be town hall meetings, AGMs, things of that nature, there's been some targeting going on there. Certainly, I'd also like to say difficult interpersonal relationships within the workplace continue to be an ongoing source of concern for employers. And it's safe to say that not every negative employee interaction turns into something more difficult. However, we are seeing again people escalate things, take to social media, and as well as get into more verbal confrontations. Frontline workers are being targeted by the public. I like to say we live in a fast food society, so when we go somewhere, we want it now. How come I can't have it? Why is nobody paying attention to me? And certainly any of those that have frontline workers need to be cognizant of that, and we're seeing that trend increase. And then on the cybersecurity side of things, certainly we're seeing, more and more, certainly cyber attacks to individuals, and I'll leave it at that. So I'll turn it over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Jim. So I am a huge fan of actually using real life events. I know Jim touched upon a few of them, but I thought this would be helpful to bring to the table and just talk about some of the main threats that we're seeing. So this one obviously is a social media and online threat. And as you can see, it's through Twitter, and it's between American Airlines and a user named Sarah. So like Jim said, through social media, we've created an ultimate soapbox for a person to stand on and to express themselves, communicate, and network with like-minded people. In this particular situation, a tweet from a then 14-year-old girl from the Netherlands caused quite a disturbance. After a well-thought response from the airline, the girl turned herself in and was later charged. Twitter then deleted the comments, and the user continued to speak to it as apparent that she wanted to become an online celebrity. While you'll likely face some type of similar situation, maybe to not obviously this degree, and we all know how airlines take these threats very seriously, there are some key points that I want to just basically talk about when you're working with online material. The first one is obviously response. It needs to be well planned if this is a route that you do want to go down. When I say this, it needs to match your organization's overall messaging, brands, etc. I think that's really what's key, is that everything flows in that direction. You need to evaluate the situation. Does it require to be escalated to the police? Who does it need to be escalated to? I think, thinking about that is the best route possible. The worst thing that you can do is just dismiss a situation and allow it to snowball. Another part is the captures. The post will likely disappear at some point, whether it be from the user who deletes it or the platform deletes it. In this case, it was Twitter who actually deleted it. So you need to properly capture this online content along with its metadata should it be required in the future. Do it properly the first time, because once it's gone, it may be gone forever. The last point is tracking, knowing who your key players are. Whether it's an angry customer or an ex-employee, keep an eye on their online activity. I'm going to move to my next example. So this one, I'm going to have to warn of the language as soon as I play it. AFI Mac does not endorse any type of language or anything that you're going to see through this video. So hopefully I can play it and everyone can hear. Oh, sorry. Okay, so again, we do not endorse any of this language whatsoever, but I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the most common threat we see come through from our clients. In this particular case, it involves an employee that's well known as a reporter with an organization. Sadly, she caught the attention of an individual when the reporter conducted a survey that he was part of. After publishing this survey, this person became upset that the reporter refused to change the information in her article. The harassment began online through Twitter, and the organization did the right thing and reported it to the police. It later turned up into showing up at the reporter's private residence. Thankfully, in this case, the harasser later checked himself into the hospital to get treatment for mental health issues. So let's quickly review the right steps in this example. I think it was handled very well, but social media was documented and captured and then turned over to the police. The organization then did two things to further ensure the safety of the reporter. A protection agent was hired to attend news coverages that this reporter was speaking at, and a thorough threat risk assessment was completed. This threat risk assessment not only covered the time that the employee was obviously at work, but it reviewed residential assessment, client interview, subject information and assessment, and lastly, personal safety recommendations that were created specifically for this reporter.
So just to jump in for a minute, Sophie, and it's Jim here. This happened in the Ottawa region, folks, and this gentleman did eventually make his way to Toronto, to where the head office of this company was located. So it very rapidly moved from, hey, this, I'll call it little problem in Ottawa, to all of a sudden, it's a downtown Toronto problem, which could be downtown anywhere. And, on top of the posting, there became another more serious element with this travel to sort of, nobody's listening to me, here I come.
Thanks, Dan. Oops, pardon me. Okay, so this is, I believe Jim kind of touched upon this one. So I'm just going to hit play before I start kind of taking a deeper dive into this one. But again, we don't endorse any of this language, so.
So folks, what I will say here is this is an individual who simply came in and asked to use the bathroom, so we're not trying to be graphic here, and they decided to do the bathroom on the floor and throw it at a frontline worker. So there's sort of a extreme example of somebody coming unglued.
So another key note that I just kind of want to jump into, Jim, in many of these instances, frontline workers have no idea how to process or deal with these types of situations. And then what the end result is a snowball effect that often results in violence. The key element here is to have proper training in place to de-escalate situations. With the majority of training that workers commonly have, it's surrounding food safety, cash handling, and first aid, as we don't put much emphasis on personal safety with the security kind of hat on. If there's a common trend, whether it be location, management needs to take a deeper dive into these occurrences. Another point I want to stress out is having front lines not work alone. You know, in this situation, obviously there is people working with them, but you know, there's options such as panic buttons, camera systems, access control. But the best thing I could say is just knowing your problem locations is a good start, and taking it from there. So I know Jim talked about this one as well. It is the targeting of senior executives, and we're seeing, more and more of this happen. In this example, I don't have a video, it's just an article. It was an eco-terrorist along with an indigenous group took it upon themselves to locate the CEO's residence and smash his windows and cover his home with paint and oil by targeting his personal life. So the obvious mandate of them is that they weren't getting the attention that they were trying to get through their other avenues, you know, whether it be social media or protests. They weren't getting the attention that they wanted. So this is a common theme that we're seeing, is that these groups that are somewhat peaceful team up with other groups for similar causes, can arise in obviously violence. So, and then there's also the factor of members becoming radicalized. It's very common where, you know, the group in question does have really good intentions, and, you know, they have a good mandate, but obviously they get a member that's more radicalized or more violent. That's when you need to really take notice of it. So typically these scenarios begin with a petition against executives or brands. When they don't get the response, they obviously turn to more violent approaches to get some immediate attention. That is their whole goal. Some of the key things here too is to ensure that executives' personal information is locked up and measures are taken to ensure the safety within the walls of employment and outside. It's also worth mentioning that when dealing with these groups and coming across many of these groups that I work with, it really depends on the mandate of the group and that they're going after your brand. You need to better understand what this actually is to actually address the problem. Ignoring the problem will not be the solution. It will likely just get worse, and they will continue to target your brand, your senior executives, your employees, everybody of the above.
So I'm going to jump in for a minute, Sophie. Any of you who are on the call who are part of the financial sector, we are seeing activist groups follow the money, and they will, we've had groups reach out to us and say, hey, we invested in a mining operation here, or we put money into a detention center, or things of that nature. And these groups will take their time to figure out and follow the money. And you're looking at it going, okay, not really my problem, but suddenly, we invested 400 million or 100 million or 10 million or whatever that number is. So bear in mind that some of the activist groups will follow the money, and then the targeting commences.
Thanks, Jim. And it's also worth noting, too, that these groups are very highly educated. They're usually very well versed in, you know, the mandate that they're trying to push. They're very young. Typically, they don't have full-time jobs, so they do have a lot of time to do this. And then obviously you have the other side where some of them are paid activists, so this is their job. So I'm going to move to my next slide. It's, you know, coworkers, difficult interpersonal relationships. I'm going to play the video really quickly. I know this case is very popular in the media, so I don't think I have to do much explaining, but I'll play the video.
This was a difficult story, and it continues to be. The women, despite our best attempts, have been reluctant to come forward publicly, though they have told their stories to us in detail and provided us with some documentary evidence, which we've reviewed, text and emails, things like that. In cases of allegations like this involving assault, and particularly sexual assault, it's not unusual that alleged victims don't put their name to a story. In this case, they said they were concerned about retribution, perhaps a lawsuit, worried for their employment in the future, and also concerned that they will be the target of vicious online assault. Today, Monday, we've already seen some of that online, where people are attacking in writing these women for speaking out to the Star. We're also interviewing other people who are coming forward with stories, and should those stories prove to be credible, we'll reveal those in the coming days or weeks. For thestar.com, I'm Kevin Donovan.
Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because I think that everybody is very familiar with this case. What we need to consider is the way you handle internal investigation. In this case, the person had a well-known reputation for his type of behavior, even to the point that young journalists were advised to not pursue internships due to the rumors of inappropriate behavior towards women. Funny enough, I think it's worth noting that Ghomeshi also advised his employer of the potential investigation from another media outlet. And what happened next was that a crisis management firm was hired, only to lead to a termination. What is key here is that no one is exempt. Members of senior leadership, high-performing producing employees, also, again, examining a person's background. I think it's worth noting, too, that there were allegations of temper and inappropriate behavior prior to his employment. So that's very key. Jim, did you want to add anything? Because I know we see a lot of cases like this.
We can move on to, because that one's debated in the news every day.
Oh.
So what to look for? I think this becomes important. So play an active role in monitoring and investigating social media activities. If you, as Sophie mentioned, got known players, or you've got some sort of troubling interaction with an individual or an employee, we do find a lot of people tend to move to social media first, and although it may start out as a post expressing displeasure, that tends to be the gateway into bigger and better things. Look for trigger events with individuals, and when I talk about trigger events, both internal and external, I'll give you an external trigger event, and it might be one where a staff member is going through a difficult divorce or family breakup. They're certainly under a great deal of stress and anxiety, and that may find its way and flow into the workplace and cause you some challenges from that perspective. Internally, there could be a host of things that may trigger, could be a downsizing, could be discipline, could be a restructuring, could be a host of things, but look for trigger events. I will simply say this to you: if any of you wind up terminating an individual, it becomes very important, particularly if it's a rather difficult termination. Start to mark down key dates, date of hire, date of termination. If you're got any information related to kids' birthdays, anniversaries, wife's birthday, and I want all of you to think that that person is sitting at home, and let's take it a year from now, going, a year ago from today, I used to have a job. A year ago from today, I used to, I had a job and it's my kid's birthday, and now I can't buy a birthday present or whatever the case may be. So trigger events, key dates become important. Certainly aggressive customers, they usually don't start out with a full frontal attack like we've seen in the Tim Hortons store, although they can, but you'll generally see bad behavior start to build and build and build. We are seeing more and more instances where mental health is a factor, and whether that be external employees or internal employees, we're seeing more impact that way. Certainly, the opiate crisis has raised challenges for all types of businesses, and you're now finding we've had clients reach out and say, "Hey, we had discovered an angry person in our washroom. We had somebody come into our building, just wandered aimlessly off the street. They're now sort of full on with our receptionist or front entrance employees." So keep that in mind. Sophie's touched on the activist group. I think in today's day and age with social media, find a cause, find an issue. There's a group out there that started a movement on Facebook. They're inviting people to attend, and you've got a whole host of things going on. And then we always, all employers have a certain element of problematic and aggressive employees, and I think we need to be cognizant. The age-old, and Sophie touched on it earlier, we're just going to ignore this behavior and it will go away. In more and more instances, we find when we're getting involved and we get to sort of when did this all start to take place, we're hearing things like, well, a year ago this happened, or 2 years ago this happened. And the problem has gotten worse over time, and it's been one where maybe it'll go away if we ignore it, but it doesn't tend to work. Sophie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to quickly add another point just to the activist groups. So many platforms out there, just so you know, on social media are turning to advance their communication levels to basically broadcast and share information and connect people with like-minded goals and, posts. So Facebook, for example, is going to be releasing a new kind of area where it's going to allow users to see news and then obviously connect with people that are talking about the same thing. So I think we're going to see a rise in activists and protests and, obviously more communication about brands, just a rise from just that. So, and with that, obviously, every social media platform out there is likely to follow the same kind of event or avenue, sorry. So this takes me to my next slide, things to consider. So these are simply a recap of all the examples we reviewed during the webinar that I just reviewed, sorry. I want to stress that each situation is unique. Therefore, solution for one may not be the right solution for another. What is key here, so let's talk about things to actually consider. Using a third-party legal representative to assist. So, just to provide an example, if you have protesters showing up weekly at your organization, perhaps, getting an injunction is key, setting that up from the get-go rather than allowing it to fester, get worse, and then have to deal with it later on. Another key point is additional security and protection agents if needed. Completing a threat risk assessment of homes and workplace. I think we're seeing, and Jim, you can agree, we're seeing more and more organizations being a little bit more open to having this done by a third party, or obviously making it a routine of a yearly goal, depending on the organization's structure, and if you have a security team, if you or health and safety that may take care of it. So another thing is monitoring social media and work-related communications. There's obviously a lot of avenues that you can take for doing this. You can learn about, obviously, Google Alerts, becoming familiar with your community groups, familiar with using different various search engines. I think that's key, especially if you don't have a communications department that is already monitoring this for you. Another key point is investigate all threats. Again, not dismissing anything. Training, so making sure all levels have the right training. That's, you know, obviously this training is applicable to what kind of that role that person is in. But I think, you know, some of them obviously translate to any role, like active shooter, just like a fire alarm drill. So security awareness. Jim and I always laugh about this one because as a Canadian society, we're very polite. I often visit clients where, you know, I'm invited to their offices and I'll have somebody open the door for me, let me in, not even ask me who I am. I guess I don't look very threatening, which is fine. But we're seeing this more and more often where people need to be, you know, polite but rude at the same time, saying, you know, I'd be happy to help you locate that person that you're looking for, but I'm not unable to let you in without a pass, that kind of thing. I think that's huge. Jim, did you want to touch on that one? Just because I know we laughed about it quite often.
Just on the security awareness piece, and I think, you know what, human nature is always to be polite. We do breach testing for a lot of organizations where we're actually brought in to sort of test their security awareness and readiness. We recently did some work and it related to some data centers, and just the simple arrive, can I please use the bathroom? And next thing you know, hey, we're in, nobody seems to check, do we come back? In a way, go that way. The other example I'll share, and this recently happened in Toronto, a group of people came into the lobby, you know, and when I say group, small group, you know, they indicate, and they've got the information off the internet that they're here to have a meeting with so-and-so. The person at the front counter immediately says, hey, they're tied up in a meeting right now. Hey, I'm just going to let you into a meeting room here. Hopefully when they get free, and away you go. They happen to be 4 activists from Greenpeace that were let into the room, and wasn't a pleasant outcome. I'm going to circle back for a minute, Sophie. On the confrontation management side of things, we're doing more and more training for organizations around effective communication. What we're finding is people do a great job of escalating situations and not a great job of de-escalating, so I think that becomes important. And the last point I'll make on the training also is with the active aggressor and active shooter, certainly we don't have a gun culture like we have in the US. If somebody said we'd be having discussions like this in Canada 10 years ago, I'd be surprised, but certainly we've seen in Toronto with the incident on the Danforth, as well as some of the other events that have happened in Canada, that's becoming more mainstream. As a matter of fact, I just finished with a federal government agency here today running active aggressor training for their facility in Ottawa, as they feel they need to be prepared in the event of unforeseen situations. So Sophie, I'll turn that back over to you.
Thanks, Jim. So this is a special one to me. So a secured and vetted vendor list. I hear this all the time. Don't wait until the last minute. Do your research on the right vendor. I think this is really important. Do your research on pricing. Do your research on experience. You know, ask for examples, ask for references. Do this before something actually happens. This is key, and I can't count on how many times, you know, I've spoken to somebody during a situation and they haven't thought about this because they thought this would never happen to them. You know, they have a great culture. They have a great, you know, sadly, the truth is it always happens to the organization when you don't expect it to happen. Another point I want to say is be open. There's tons of great tools out there. Be open to networking, be open to, you know, learning more things. I think that's also a big plus in these type of situations. Contingency plans and risk teams, have this set up just like your vendors prior to. So in the example of having a risk team, you know, if you get a cyber breach, what happens? Who's going to take charge? You know, having those kind of contingency plans set up in place will put you ahead in the game. The last point I want to kind of bring up is, sure.
Sorry, I just jumped in here for a second, Sophie. I think when we talk about having risk plans, I just want to make this point, and I'm seeing this quite often. I think the Me Too movement has brought a lot of things to light, and I think more and more employers are running training. I think one of the trends I'm seeing is they're not necessarily dealing with the what if when something gets reported. So we get a lot of calls coming in saying, hey, we ran some training on sexual harassment and bullying. And the example I'll give you, this is a meat processing facility. The lady says, hey, you ran me through the training the other day. You told us we were to report the following things. And what she says next is, I don't want to get Fred in trouble, but he said if I don't leave him alone, he has a knife in his hand, I want you to picture this, he's going to gut me like a deer. And it's sort of, we've ticked the box on the, yes, we run training, but more importantly, what's that back end look like when someone comes into an HR office or health and safety or however that's reported and says, here's what's happening. And, you know, we put something together quickly, but they clearly realized, we've done all the right things on the upfront. Now we need to get prepared for what are we going to do? How do we escalate? How do we communicate? How do we deal with this? In this particular case, when they got to the bottom of it, this employee had been a problematic employee for a long time, and every time he threatened somebody where he showed them the knife and made a comment, they would leave him alone and let him go about doing what he was doing at an extremely slow pace. So it was a learned behavior on this chap's end. And sorry, that's enough on that piece, Sophie.
Thanks, Jim. So the last point I want to bring up is having and this is what I see all the time, and I think this is why I kind of saved this point for the last point here, but having all suppliers, contract workers, and other companies on the same page. So I'll give you an example that I see very, very often, especially in the activism and protester world. Where I've come in to see organizations and, you know, their contract truckers or whoever they're using tries to run over an activist because they're trying to do their job. So another example that I'll use is I recently viewed a protest at a school board, and the security guard basically was just unable to answer any of the protesters' questions when they were trying to get interviews, I guess, with senior leadership team. So that's key. Obviously, these people don't work for you, so I know it's a little bit difficult. But having, you know, the communication sent out to them, you know, giving them tips on how to work with these people, or, you know, relaying your message on how you're approaching a problem is very key to having everything flow. Because obviously, these people do represent your brand, even though they're a different company. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim.
So legal obligations, I'll preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, but certainly employers do have obligations. So certainly whatever area or jurisdiction you're in, be familiar with the occupational health and safety legislation, certainly criminal code, as well as the human rights code and things of that nature, and any other applicable legislation that requires it at the end of the day. Investigation requirements for you as an employer. So we are certainly seeing a trend where more and more workplace investigations are being handed out to third-party organizations to handle. Again, management wants to be impartial. There are some legislative requirements and things that have been put in place, but certainly I think it's important to be aware of those, understand what they are, understand what your obligations are, and then make sure, and I'm certainly not saying here every situation warrants using a external third party. An example, Sophie and I were called out to a workplace last week. This had merely started out as an employee walking into HR saying, hey, I think I've heard something from a coworker. that's inappropriate, it's troubling to me. And then she basically relayed that the individual had a very explicit discussion surrounding pornography. Concern at the end of the day was, how far reaching does this go? We did go in, interview all parties involved. Certainly the discussion was inappropriate in nature. They've managed to deal with it from a workplace investigation standpoint, but also from a security standpoint, and put some things in place for this lady in terms of how she gets to her vehicle, back and forth. The individual has since been disciplined and let go from the organization, and so there's sort of some ongoing things there to make sure that the situation's properly managed.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So I had to add a little bit of humor on this. I apologize, but so the next kind of area that we want to talk about is high-risk terminations. So HR types. We tend to look at terminations in a different way. While HR typically labels terminations as either voluntary or involuntary, we tend to define them according to risk level. Regardless of both types, there's always risks associated with any termination. Developing a sound termination practice is key. Jim, I'm just going to turn it over to you now.
So here's an example, folks, and I'm not going to bore you with going through the slide and reading here. We had an employer, they had an individual who assaulted another coworker in the workplace. The person was suspended pending further investigation. Company conducted an internal investigation. It was deemed that the employee's behavior was egregious and unacceptable. They brought him into the organization. He had a union representative present, and they talked to him about his exit from the organization. And this person had a long history of very aggressive, inappropriate behavior towards other coworkers. The union representative said, hey, the gentleman should be able to leave with their dignity intact, head held high, no need to further embarrass the individual. They were remorseful, and along with a bunch of other things. And what had happened is that particular client had engaged us to provide some additional security measures, and we were advised, please stand down. And the protocol with that organization is anytime they have what's deemed a high-risk termination, the individuals to be escorted to their locker. They're then to be escorted to their vehicle and asked to leave the property. The decision was made to let the person peacefully leave on their own. I think within 5 minutes of that, the phone calls started to come in from the shop floor that he had made his way down to the shop floor and had physically attacked the individual that he had a confrontation with a day earlier. So just keep in mind when you're dealing with any type of termination, people can certainly have an outburst, and I think it's important to follow your protocols, although they may seem harsh and they may seem silly, or maybe why do I need to do this? In the odd instance where something does go wrong, it does work out effectively. Obviously, if you're dealing with any sort of mass downsizing, restructuring, that can be problematic. And then certainly we are seeing instances where facilities are being closed and things of that nature, and that certainly can add a heightened element of risk to employers. Sophie, you're up.
Okay, so the next slide is a very popular, well, not popular, but well-known case. Like I have mentioned previously in this presentation, Canadians were very lucky. We don't see very much violence in the workplace, as you know, obviously there is an increase, but this one is a very good example of a termination that went wrong. And I just wanted to quickly highlight some of the key points about this case. The employee had a history of being unable to hold a position at several companies. The employee had a history of losing his temper. The employee did not have a criminal record. The employee was showing signs of mental health issues, making comments that he was not safe at work, starting to bring weapons to work just for his personal safety being. And let's talk more about what went wrong. So the first part that I can't help but notice is the termination was completed in a room where there were items that could be used as weapons. So he used a stapler, a nameplate to attack before he pulled out his knife. Another key thing is the location of the actual termination. It was on the 5th floor of the building. It also created no escape route for the victims that were cornered, and then obviously resulted in multiple people getting stabbed. What ended this situation? Not the police, not a security person, but a fellow employee who spoke Mandarin and was able to calm this person down and hand over the weapon. So regardless of size, organization, culture, there's a lot of things that we need to take into consideration, which leads me to my next slide. So obviously what to consider: the person's personality and their current situation, having the right people present and take part in that termination, ensuring that certain people aren't around, close acquaintances, relatives, etc. Determining the best location for the termination, whether it be on-site, off-site, that's all dependent on the person. Room and seating plan, just like I used in the example previously, you know, having everything off the desk, having the position of a chair of the person conducting the termination so they can have an easy exit should that person become angry. Another point is, you know, having a security person right outside the door in case something does need to be escalated. Another key thing is developing a concrete exit plan, so package signing options. Ensuring that the person doesn't have to come back into the office. So you're not inviting that person to come back into the office for whatever reason. Having on-site counselors available if needed. Stating exit rules, so no trespassing, NDA, access cards, all those kind of things that you need to keep into consideration. And then lastly, monitoring that individual prior to and after the termination. I think that would have been key, especially in the example that I just used before. In eliminating, you know, an awful situation.
So very quickly, Sophie used the word security, and I just want to preface this. In most cases, when we're engaged, and I would encourage all employers, if you're engaging security, make sure they're plain clothes. Sometimes a uniform will just act to exasperate the situation. The other thing that I think becomes really important, and we're certainly seeing this with millennials, we had a situation last year, individual was using and distributing a host of drugs and narcotics at the company workplace. We were in the process of interviewing the individual and working towards an exit when in came the room. Very angry man, probably mid-50s. Turns out it was the kid's father, and the kid had squeezed a text off, "Hey, Dad, I'm at work. I'm in trouble. You need to come and help me." And we now had an angry father to contend with. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. Okay. I think the other thing that's important here, folks, on the law enforcement side, I think we all and most employers think I'm just going to pick up and call the police and they're going to save the day. Certainly that is not the case. Certainly they're there to help. But don't always just rely solely on the police's involvement, because essentially it is your problem to solve, and they will only look into matters if it involves a criminal code offense or if it's a violent act or things of that nature. Remember, always law enforcement will try to remain neutral, so they will view your problems often as a workplace problem and don't care to get involved in those. Policing tends to be reactive in nature, not proactive, so they're not going to sit in a parking lot waiting for something to happen. And please also keep in mind, law enforcement is very stretched from a resource standpoint, so although they, in some instances, would very much like to help, they don't always have the bodies to do that.
Okay, Jen, thank you. I'm just going to jump in here if you don't mind. So another key point that I do want to share with the group is understanding your police force is key. You know, obviously, dependent on the situation that you're encountering, are there specialized bureaus to further assist you? Developing a go-to contact, you know, meeting with a community liaison officer is often a good start into this. And then obviously, just to further this point, when dealing with the police, your best case scenario is to be well organized with your information. You know, provide the police or your contact with as much information as possible. They do have limited resources, and therefore, if you make it easier for them, it'll be easier for them to assist you. So those are.
So just to add to what Sophie was saying, and sorry, Sophie, there was an incident in Stratford recently. I believe that it involved a school earlier this year, and it went into a lockdown mode. And the SWAT team that was needed to respond to that had to come out of London, Ontario. So that's, from a geography standpoint, roughly a 45-minute to an hour drive. So I use that example because I think we all watch a lot of TV, and certainly if we watch, you know, the next episode of CSI Miami, they're there, you know, 3 seconds after you call, you've got a whole entourage waiting for you, and that's not always the case.
Okay, so that leads us to our next slide. You'll notice that there is a chat box on the right-hand side. You can obviously write a question right now, or if you prefer, I will be supplying the group with our emails should you have a question that you want to be answered offline. So I'll give it a minute or two, but so I'll just go to the next slide while we wait if there are any. So I just want to quickly tell everybody about the upcoming experts webinars that we have coming up. We have an integrity testing. Are your vendors and employees playing by the rules? We hear more and more people, you know, question. You know, we're finding more and more in situations where, you know, it's an employee that owns a company and hasn't disclosed it, but then obviously your company works with that company, and there's a conflict of interest there. So that's a really good webinar coming up. And then we have what to do when the union ignores a court injunction. That's for all you unionized groups. And then the last one we have scheduled is for have you become a target of activists, which I will be speaking of. I mentioned a few bits and pieces about that during this presentation, so I will be expanding on a lot of those. And then lastly, I've included the link where you can view all these webinars and register.
And then just to close things off, folks, one of the questions that popped up is, will we be sharing the slides from the PowerPoint? And the answer to that is yes, we will be sending those out, and you'll be managing that process, correct, Sophie?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope everybody has a great afternoon, and have a good day.
Okay, thanks everyone, and appreciate it. And we will get the slide decks out to everybody that was involved here today. Thank you. Bye.